This is the infamous hair length chapter that a lot of people seem to have a lot of trouble with. One thing I've noticed this past week is I've read a lot of people's opinions on these first 16 verses, and there's a lot of stuff out there, and there's a lot of what ifs, we think and we suppose, and it's really kind of difficult. After I read so much stuff, my eyeballs were going like this, and my mind was doing just about the same thing. And it's not really, I don't think, a very difficult section for us to understand if we understand what it's about. And that's probably what I'm going to spend most of the morning talking about, because after we understand the situation that Paul and the Corinthians were in, then the rest of it seems to fall into place. So in chapter 11, verses 1 through 16, in our preliminary thoughts, let's look at it from this way. We have to approach it understanding the situation. First of all, there are three things that Paul teaches here in this particular chapter. There's a secular thing, there's a natural thing, and then it all comes down to doing what is spiritually right. So when we look at the secular ideas of it, he refers to the head coverings as something that is physical head coverings that people wear over their heads. And then he talks about the natural head coverings, which is the person's hair. And when it all comes down to it, the idea that Paul is trying to teach these people is that we need to observe God's authority. And this was important for him to emphasize. And we'll see that the secular and the natural is dependent upon the situation of the time. But no matter what era and human existence that you live, it all comes down to observing God's authority in this particular matter. So when we look at the head coverings that Paul was talking about, this was unique for the time that Paul lived. Not so much for our time today. Now, granted, you go into some countries, like our Muslim countries, they'll require women to wear headscarves or something even more drastic than that. But then the head coverings that are natural has been established for all time. So if the culture does not require women to wear headscarves, then we have a natural covering for women. But the whole idea is to observe the authority of God. Now, some things are determined by local and cultural practices. For example, foot washing was a custom in the time of Christ. When you went into someone's home, they washed your feet. You come into my home, you're not going to get your feet washed, but I'll give you a tub of water and a washcloth until you get after it. But that was a custom at that particular time. But what Jesus was teaching was that we need to exemplify humility. And if you come in and tell me to wash your feet, I'd probably do it anyway, just to be nice for you. The holy kiss was a common practice of a friendly greeting. Today, men shake hands, women hug each other. I had an aunt one time that was a die-hard Italian Catholic that her roots went way back, and every time she came to see us, I had a red lipstick all over my face. So I tried to run when I knew she was coming. But that was how people greeted each other. Excuse me. Paul taught, and we saw in an earlier chapter 7, that it was better for the Corinthians not to marry because of the present distress. And that was time specific. He was encouraging them that if you want, you remember our study, if you don't want to have persecution and more problems, don't marry. So we see that these were some commands and some, suggestions, recommendations that people do that are, time period specific. Now, the underlying principle of 1 Corinthians 11, especially 2 through 16, was recognizing that the authority of God and submitting to his authority. And this principle continues to be necessary and must be applied as needed in various cultures. So if you go to Turkey and they say you've got to wear a head covering, it's best you put on the head covering or you're going to suffer for it. And those kinds of things. Now, from this particular section, it was evident that two things were possibly happening. That some men were wearing head coverings, or they had let their hair grow to where they were indistinguishable from women. And that women was possibly discarding their head coverings in the public, arena that they lived in. So, as we get into this is chapter 1 of this is chapter 11 of 1 Corinthians. We see that Paul describes the relationship of authority, verse 3. Then we see that there are rules concerning men, verses 11, 7 through 9, and 14. Rules concerning women, 5 through 6, 10, 13, 15, and 16. And rules concerning both men and women. You can kind of keep that in perspective, that there's rules relating to authority, relating to men, relating to women, and then both men and women, as it relates to the authority of Christ. It kind of all falls into place. Now, Paul describes the relationship with authority in verse 3 like this. The head of woman is man, the head of man is Christ, and the head of Christ is the Father. Now, for the rules concerning men, he tells us that a man's head is to be uncovered. Now, this demonstrates his relationship to Christ, demonstrates his relationship to woman. His hair is not to be long. We see that in those verses up above. Then we see, concerning the woman, her head is to be covered. This demonstrates her relationship to Christ, her relationship to man, and her relationship to the angels. Rules concerning both men and women. Woman is not to be independent of man. Man is not to be independent of woman. And both are under the authority of God. That's what we see in this particular chapter. Now, if I were to break this chapter down, and I'll kind of go through this real quick, Paul encourages them to imitate his life, and is thankful for remembering his teachings. The established order of authority, dishonorable head coverings, reasons why for covering and not covering one's head. Man and women are dependent on each other, and both are belonging to God. Teachings of nature, secular and church customs. Now, it's kind of, we kind of looked at here in just a moment. Now, Paul's encouragement and thankfulness, verses 1 and 2. He connects, verse 1 they say should be the end of verse, chapter 10 and not part of chapter 11. I kind of look at it as a reminder of these people to do what he's done. Imitate my life as I imitate Christ, you'll be okay. And that's what he's encouraging. And all the things that he said, all the things that he's about to say. Imitate me as I also imitate Christ. Now I praise you, brother, that you remember me in all things and keep the traditions as I delivered them unto you. He's thankful for them. He praises them for what they did, and that is remember the things that he has taught them and all the traditions that he's delivered unto them. Now we're not talking about the kind of traditions that the Jews had that were really in violation of the law of Moses, but the traditions that he's talking about here is the teachings that Christ gave unto man and that the apostles were delivering. So it's not traditions that are outside the gospel of Christ. And we'll just kind of touch on that and keep going, because I don't really think that's as important as the rest of the chapter. But he's thankful that they are following him. He's thankful that they remember him, and he knows that what he's about to say, that they will follow his instructions on that. Now, God's established order of authority. The word head means he is one's leader. Now, both men and women are spiritually equal before God. Galatians 3:28-29 tells us that. For you're all one in Christ Jesus, whether you're man or female, Jew or Greek, in Christ you're all one. However, this does not eradicate the hierarchy of authority that God has established. That is, Christ is over man, man is over woman, and that God is over Christ. That is not done away with. She is still subject to her husband. Her wife is still subject to her husband, as in Ephesians 5:21 and 24. Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands as to the Lord. Again, we see the authority being established. So what the gospel of Christ does is that it puts us on an equal plane with him in our spiritual life. But as we continue to live on earth, we still have to have that sense of authority in relationship to each other and to Christ established. Otherwise, we're going to have chaos in the world. Now, The husband-wife relationship is one of love and respect as equal inheritors of God's blessings. If we can understand that, then we have no problem with understanding God's role of authority. Now, jump over to verse 14, because I think this is really kind of the key to the whole chapter. The teachings of nature, dishonor, and glory. Now, we see that, and we'll see here in just a moment, that men were known to wear veils as a sign of authority or in pagan religious activity. It actually happened during their time. Men actually had a veil over their head. For example, this is Augustus Caesar. And if you'll notice, he's got a veil over his head, symbol of authority. Now, this is another relief that was found on a wall someplace. But evidently, here's a man of some significant authority. He's got his head veiled, as does his wife. Now, I want you to notice something else. See the other guys, length of their hairs, and they're not veiled. Now, here's a religious practice. I don't know what it entails, but we have the religious priest with his head veiled, and everybody else doesn't. And notice the length of their hair. Here's another one similar to it. Here's the priest with his head veiled, and look at the other. Here's a guy that kind of wants to buck the trend. But notice the culture of the time. And then here's a wedding ceremony. Here's the husband and the wife. She's got her head veiled, he doesn't. Evidently, the priest, whoever's officiating it, has his head veiled. And here's a woman with her children with her head veiled. Now, I threw this one up here. And I think if this was something that me and Janelle saw when we were in Rome. We went to the catacombs over in the Appian Way. And this is in a museum. I don't know if this is the original, if they cut off the wall, put in the museum and replaced it with a facsimile or what, but we saw this in the Appian Way. And in Rome, notice the hairstyles. Now, with that said, we see that the culture of the time that men were wearing veils for particular reasons. So Paul is probably thinking, here we have Corinthians that are actually trying to imitate some of these important people or for religious practices, and now they're covering their heads to be like the pagans that they came out of. Or if they had long hair, he made the mention over in chapter 6. Remember, as some of you were, and he went through the list, thieves, adulterers, homosexuals, sodomites, which is identified as effeminate, men that were trying to identify as a woman. So he may be trying to, overcome a culture that they came out of, that they were familiar with, and that they were trying to imitate. I'm an important person, I'm doing religious practice, I'm going to cover my head even though I am a man. So he appeals to the voice of nature. So what is the voice of nature that we see here? If we were to say, doesn't nature teach you this? And we look to, the world around us, the plants and the flowers and the animals, it doesn't teach us man should have short hair, woman should have long hair. But what does the word nature mean? Well, it comes from the Greek word physis and is used in the following passages. 2 Peter 1:4, the state one can change into. Ephesians 2:3, the influence of society. And Galatians 2:15, how one adheres to the law of God. He says, by which you have been given to us exceeding your great precious promises, that through these you may be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption of this world. Influence of society, fulfilled with the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, just as the others, following what was natural in the culture in which they lived. And how one adheres to the law? We who are Jews by nature, by the teaching of the law, we are Jews. We were chosen by God. The natural world didn't make them Jews, but God made them Jews. So, we see that when we look at the word nature and we make that application in verse 14, what Paul is saying is, does not even nature teach you the customs of the time that you live in? Don't they teach you that it's wrong and that it's right for certain things? So think of this particular chapter as the culture in which they lived. So with that said, let's take a look at what Paul considers to be dishonorable coverings. He says in verse 4, every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. For that is one and the same as if she had been shaved, as her head were shaved. If a woman is not covered, let her be shorn. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and the glory of God. But woman is the glory of man. Now, what Paul is saying here is that every man, now let me back up here. The setting that Paul puts this in is praying or prophesying. So we're seeing this in a public setting in which these things are happening. And it could be in a private setting also. It's not indicated to us, we just don't know. But every man who prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. Like the priests that were giving the sacrifice that we saw in those reliefs that were cut on the wall, they had their head covered. People were thinking, that's the way the pagans do it, I need to do it too. But he's saying, if you cover your head, you dishonor your head before God because you reflect the glory of God. Do not cover your head. Now, every woman who prays with her head uncovered dishonors her head. Now, we'll talk about that in just a moment. But the woman's head needs to be covered, whether it is with a physical covering, like we saw in the reliefs, or if it's the natural hair, which we will see down in verse 15. Woman's head is to be covered. Now, verse 6, if you look at it, not covered, it is shameful. If it's shameful, covered. That's what he's saying here. And he's saying if it is shameful, you might as well just go ahead and cut the rest of your hair off because you have no respect for the gospel of Christ and no respect for the authority that God has given to you. So, if a man ought not, for a man indeed ought not to cover his head because he is the image of God. Created in his image, we reflect the glory of God. And we'll see that woman, let's take a look at this here in just a moment. The creation order explained. As man reflects the image of God, the woman reflects the glory of man. We were made from the dust in the image of God. Woman was taken from us, and she reflects the glory of man. But at the same time, it's kind of like the sun reflecting off the moon. We see the glory of God. It's the same thing with the woman. As she looks, as we are the glory to the woman, we are actually reflecting the glory of God to her. So the humanity as we see each other is the glory of God expressed within us. And if we have the glory of God, we should respect his role of authority. Now, he says in verse 9, now was the woman created, nor was the man, the woman, for man is not from woman, but woman from man. The creation is being described here. Nor was man created for the woman, but the woman for man. For this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Now, you can kind of look at this two ways. And when we understand how the creation, the role of creation, how things happened, and we see that God has established authority based on the role of creation and what happened in creation, the symbol of authority on her head is evidently her covering. Now, whether or not that shows her authority or that her respect to authority is, I'm still kind of tossing that one around. But I kind of review it as a symbol that it is the authority of her subjection to man, as God has put it. Now, what benefit does that have for the angels? Well, let's see. Well, authority is defined as power, authority, weight, so forth. It has two, the authority of a woman has two things. I kind of got ahead of myself with the slides. The symbol of a woman's authority is for two reasons. First reason is, it shows man's authority that was given by God over woman. Can't help that, that's the way it was made. But it also shows that woman that is abiding by the law of God, it demonstrates to God the love she has for his ways. So it's not a submissive type thing, but the authority that we are seeing is that she is submitting to the authority that God has given to us, and she loves his ways. And that authority reflects upon the man that is over her in that reflection. The second thing is for the benefit of the angels. Now, there's been a lot said about this. Nobody knows what Paul was talking about. And when I say nobody, the 10 or 15 commentators I've got in my library, they say nobody knows. So I'm going to go with that as nobody knows. But the best thing that I can kind of pin down is Paul is talking about authority. He's talking about submission in that role of authority. So if she is showing her authority by her covering, then the only thing I can figure out is this benefits the angels for two reasons. We know in Jude 6 that the angels that left their first estate, God cast down. So that tells me that angels evidently have a law that they live under. We don't know what that is, but if you're going to transgress something, and if you're going to do something that's going to cause God to cast you down, there has to be a law for you to transgress. So I'm thinking angels are under some kind of law. And it may be like that old play, Dr. Faustus. You remember that from school? When Satan says, it's better to rule in hell than it is to serve in heaven. That might have been the intent of some of these angels, and God cast them out. We don't know. But they left their first estate, and God cast them down. Now, about a woman wearing the veil, either physical or the natural covering, the woman is respecting her position in her estate that she has found herself in, like the angels did, and she proves to the angels that respecting God is righteous and that we'll find his favor. That benefits the angels. By refusing this symbol of authority, she confirms for the angels that disrespecting God's law will bring shame and eventual condemnation upon you, just like those angels that were cast down. That's the only thing I can, of any sense, correlate with this particular chapter, because Paul is talking about honor and respect and dishonor, and how that applies to the angels. This is the only way that I figured that it could apply. I may be wrong, someone may have a better answer, I don't know. But I'll just leave it at that, because it shows respect and it shows authority by her submission to God's will. Now, when we look in 11 through 12, it says that, nevertheless, neither is man independent of woman, nor woman independent of man in the Lord. For as woman came from man, even so man also comes through woman. But all things belong to God. Man and woman cannot be independent of each other. If they just totally separated themselves on two continents, the world would come to, you'd hear crickets within the generation. But they are dependent upon each other for their existence. Woman's existence is because of the existence of man. She was taken from man's side. Man's existence is because of the existence of a woman. Through the natural process of birth, man comes into this world. So they are dependent upon each other for the structure of God's creation. All things, including man and woman, comes from God and belongs to God. Back to the rule of authority that Paul established in verse 3. He said, we have to have structure, we have to have authority, we have to have the understanding of where it all comes from. It comes from God. Because of all this, God established the rules of authority and how the conduct should be made within these bounds. So if you have authority or certain things that man can do that woman cannot do, certain things that woman can do that man cannot do, those are the bounds of authority. But it all comes underneath the umbrella of what God has established. Since we are his creation, he has the right to make the rules. It's kind of like that old saying, whoever has the gold makes the rules. Well, whoever created this world is the one who makes the rules, and that's the one that we have to abide by. So the teachings of nature, secular and church customs, we talked quite a bit about that. But he says, judge among yourselves. Now he's saying, use your common sense. Use your wisdom that you know of the gospel, and just use common sense. Judge among yourselves. You're able to do this. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Well, from society's standards in Paul's time, no, it was not. You had to have a cloth over your head. Today, we don't require a cloth, but the head still has to be covered. Does not even nature teaching that if a man has long hair, it is dishonor to him? We'll talk about that in just a moment. When a man tries to make himself look in the same as a woman by the length of his hair, it becomes a dishonor to him. But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory for her. The long hair is what gives her that covering, that puts her in that establishes her realm of authority with God, is that covering. For her hair was given to her for a covering. Now, if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. Now, two things are established here. We, and I'm not sure who he is referring to here, have no such custom. It could be that he's talking about the apostles and the rest of the Christian world. But he also says, nor do the churches of God, which kind of limits me to this idea that this was a particular problem that was isolated in Corinth, because there was no other custom in the churches of God elsewhere. This was not a custom or a problem that we have. That is, I think, the religious leaders, the apostles, maybe the preachers, the evangelists that were going out into the world. But it was a problem that may have been isolated to Corinth. So he says, judge among yourselves. You have the ability to do this. Is it honorable for men to have long hair or covering? Paul asks two questions in this section. Is it proper for women to pray to God with uncovered hairs? And is it honorable for man to have long hair, that is, a head covering? The natural custom of the day dictated for women to be covered. The natural custom of the day, as we saw in those reliefs on the board, that it was a custom of that day for men to have short hair. There was a distinction between the two. Now, I will say this. There was a video that I really, really, really wanted to put in the newsletter. I mean, this guy nailed it in 5 minutes. But the problem with that video was the angle in which he shot it when he was standing in front of these statues, was that for about 4 minutes out of the whole thing, you were sitting there and looking at the pride and glory of a naked man the whole time. I said, there's no way I can put that out and let you guys, have that off to the side looking at it while he's going through them. So if you were to turn the video, the monitor down and just listen to the audio, he nailed it. And that's basically what he's saying here, is that in the Greek culture, men with long hair, the Romans conquered the Greeks. And in the Greek culture at that particular time, the Greeks had long hair. And the conquering statues that the Romans erected, he said, the reason why we did it is, and you can point to the long hair on those men, he says, because you're nothing more than girly boys. And we with short hair, we're the strong, masculine guys. And it was kind of a dishonor to them. But the custom of that day, now that Rome had taken them over and the Greeks were beginning to follow the Roman customs, was for men to have short hair. Now, the Greek gods at that particular time had long hair, and guys that did have long hair were probably trying to imitate these gods. I don't know. But be that as it may, that's a different subject altogether. So Paul concludes this about what he's saying. God has ordained that a woman has been given long hair for her glory and for her covering. It's not as a punishment. It's for her glory and for her covering. A man has been given short hair for his honor. I'm not trying to tell you what to do, but it's just you're honorable if you have short hair. And if there's no head coverings needed, being the custom of the day, woman still has her covering. That is her hair. So the custom of the day does not really dictate what God has established for man and woman. Now, the custom of the day says the woman has got to wear a veil, or she's got to wear a baseball cap or a cowboy hat, whatever it may be. You know, women needs to understand that in order to show her glory to God, not only before God, but before the men and people that she's living among, she has to be mindful of that. So, finally, after I did all this talking, what constitutes long and short? How long's a rope? I like to use that phrase, how long's a rope? How long is a man's hair to be before he loses his honor? It's honorable for a man to have short hair. How long does it have to be before he begins to lose his honor before God? Next question is, how short is a woman's hair to be before she loses her glory before God? Uh-oh. Okay, Ted, where's the tape measure? Where's the tape measure? Well, God has not provided us with a specified length. Now, there are some in the church today that will say that, you have got, woman's hair has got to be at least 12 inches long. A man's hair cannot touch his collar. A woman's dress has got to be 6 inches below her knees. God has not given us specific measurements, but he has given us the attitude of heart that will dictate to us what we think will be acceptable before God's sight. He allows us to make that determination for ourselves. So, men and women, hair length, the clothes that you wear, costly array, whatever it may be, you have to look at yourself, all of us, and make that determination. Is my appearance in this world for others to see, is it the reflection of God that the world needs to see? And when we have that attitude of heart to mold ourselves physically to meet God's expectations, then we have reached what is necessary for us to be found favorable before God. You see, the length should be determined as a point where a woman starts to look as a man and a man starts to look as a woman. You see, there's that crossing point. And when you try to reach, if you tell yourself, I want to try to get as close as I can because I like the style, then you're hitting that fence that you're trying to straddle. I'll try to get as close to the world as I can without going over. But the idea should be, we should mold ourselves to the expectation that God wants us to be, so that we can reflect him in this particular world. It should not be how long or how short can I get to the point that we start crossing that boundary. You see, this is the point where we become contentious. That's what Paul says. If anyone seems to be contentious, let them know that we don't have this custom in the rest of the world. We become contentious with God's law of authority, honor, and subjection. You think about that. How we dress, how we physically show ourselves to the world is a reflection of God and our respect to his authority and the honor that we show him and our subjection that we have to him. Now, in conclusion, as Paul said, faithfully follow God's commands. Imitate me as I imitate Christ. Learn about Paul and how he followed Christ. I think there's no doubt that Paul made it to heaven. If we can imitate Paul's life here on earth, we have imitated the life of Christ. Respect the role of authority established by God, and don't rebel against it. Let those who see our appearance be it as a reflection of our God, and understand that the world and its customs is really not our guide for conduct before God. We have sometimes conform ourselves to society, but we understand that ultimately the thing is the authority of God. You remember as we started out, secular, physical, the bottom line is we have to make sure that we have the spiritual. So, chapter 11, verses 1 through 16, I think our book misapplies it. It says women must wear a veil when praying or prophesying. It kind of points the finger to the women. But what Paul is doing is he's pointing the finger to both men and women. So I think that should be better said, man and woman, how they appear in public and how they worship God and how we should conduct ourselves. or something along that line. Now, don't anybody, I don't see anybody come up to me afterwards and say, Ted, is my hair too long? My hair too short? Now, and the reason why I say that, and I'm gonna say it just like Paul said, judge among yourselves. That's a decision you have to make. It's not a decision that I will make for you, nor can I make it for you. That's a personal decision that you have to make before God and before the world. Comments?
In verse 5, are they saying the women were supposed to keep their heads uncovered even at their house? Or covered when, in verse 4, we're talking about the guy that's, praying and prophesying. Sounds like he's in maybe in a congregation or something like that. And so, Paul's already said the women aren't supposed to be saying anything in church, so listen down here. If this woman was praying, where's she at? She supposed to keep her head covered in the house?
Well, we'll talk about that down the road. We're fixing to run across that in just a moment.
Okay.
About women keeping silence. There was a particular time which the women were given prophecies by God. We saw over in Acts, was it 18, I believe, where this man had some daughters that prophesied. So we know that they were speaking by the authority of God. You know, whether or not it was in a congregational setting or not, I'm not sure. It may have just been in a regular setting. That I think is something a little bit different from what we see here. What Paul is covering here, is talking about here is specifically the covering itself. Now, if she is in her home setting, she may not have the physical veil on her that customs may have, but she will still have her hair as a covering. Now, if she was out in public, or whether or not she was in a congregational setting and the prophecy began, she had to have her head covered. Now, speaking in a public assembly, we'll cover it another time. Saved by the bell, so to speak. But difficult things that I think sometimes we tend to overlook or take for granted. But anyway, I hope the lesson